Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to Shaping Tomorrow on IKIM Radio. I'm Shafiq Burhanuddin, a fellow at IKIM. And Alhamdulillah, in this episode, we are grateful to once again have as our guest, Dr. Khalif Muammar, who is a director at the Center for Advanced Studies on Islam, Science and Civilization, RZS-CASIS, to be more specific, the Zarith Sofiah Center for Advanced Studies on Islam, Science and Civilization, based at University Technology Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Khalif.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillah, and inshallah this episode is basically the second episode with Dr. Khalif Muammar, where we are discussing on this theme of Muslim political thought. But this time we are naming this episode as the reviving a wiser Muslim political thought, and hopefully we can derive beneficial insights and knowledge from Dr. Khalif on this subject. Dr. Khalif, perhaps to resume our conversation from where we left off. In the first episode, we focused on trying to understand on the very basic notions of how Muslim scholars in the past, based on the Quran and the statements of the Prophet, understood notions like siyasa compared to how the term is understood in politics and the implications. And I think we discussed many things in terms of its how Muslims throughout the past, throughout the history, have viewed the notion of politics very differently from the West in general. But on today, perhaps we'd like to begin by understanding these more in terms of how this is being practiced by the Muslims then and perhaps today. Because on the one hand, we see that there is a tendency by certain Muslim groups to emphasize on the need to establish the Islamic State. That is one tendency. And on the other tendency is perhaps to simply regard that Western democracy as something as inherently Islamic, as something that is already agreeable with Islam. But how would you view this sort of tension, Dr. Khalif? And would you say that Islam has a certain vision of a particular political system? Dr. Khalif, please.
Thank you, Shafiq. Very pertinent, important question. First of all, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wa mursalin Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. With regard to the idea of establishing an Islamic state, yes, so there are definitions put forward by scholars, contemporary scholars in particular, with regard to what is an Islamic state. With regard to this idea, of course, there are many tendencies among Muslims today. When they say that they want to establish an Islamic state, they want a state that fully implement the Sharia. Right? So this idea, we need to understand intellectually, philosophically, to establish an institution, any Islamic institution, we need to prepare the ground.
Right.
We need to first to ensure that the ground is ready for any institution to be established properly. So the ground will ensure that we have a conducive ecosystem for that institution. Otherwise, the institution will easily collapse. That's happened in many countries. And they try to establish an Islamic state. In the end, they fail to do that because in the first instance, they do not have the clear idea what actually is. They don't have the discourse in the first place. So implementing Sharia, of course, we are all as Muslims. Individually, we are obligated. It's necessary, it's compulsory for all Muslims to implement the Sharia, because Sharia, in general, is the commands of God in the Quran and the Sunnah. So whatever in our capacity to implement, we have to implement. That's how Muslims submit to the will of God. So, but before we talk about Sharia, we need to relate to the Aqidah. And we know that Prophet ﷺ spent 13 years in Makkah just to preach and to teach and to ensure that the Aqidah, the worldview, is in place. So we have ayat Makkiyah, which quite different in nature compared to ayat Madaniyah. So in order to implement the Sharia, the Prophet has to establish the ground in Makkah, and that require a lot of energy, a lot of time, and therefore when they immigrated to Medina, they are ready to implement the Sharia, and there is no difficulty in that case. The same thing with political institution. Imam Ghazali talk about the tree of justice. There are branches of this tree of justice, but Imam Ghazali emphasizes on the roots of this tree of justice, and the manner, the situation of the branches depend on the roots. So therefore, we must emphasize on the root. So any idea to have an Islamic state, to implement the Sharia fully, if the basic problem have not been settled, and that is the problem of worldview, then we cannot have that institution ready to be implemented. So we must settle the confusion in the realm of worldview first. Once we have the knowledge, then we can practice that knowledge properly. The problem is that when we see we have problem in our practice, so the fact that there are problems in our practice, it means there are problem in our knowledge. The institution that we built, there are crises in our institution. That signifies that there are crises in our thinking, in our knowledge. So there are a lot of confusion in our knowledge of religion in particular. So we should not take for granted the problem of knowledge and because ilm and amal must be synchronized. When we find that our amal is problematic, then that signifies that there are problems in our knowledge. With regard to the idea, to the question, the second question on the political system, whether we have any kind of political system in our tradition, as I mentioned just now, there are a lot of confusion. So, for example, when they talk about Islamic political system, what they have in mind is theocracy.
Right.
So they try to establish the so-called Islamic Republic, Islamic State, yes. But what they truly implement is a theocracy, and that really is not something that familiar in our tradition. It is very alien from our tradition. So this idea of theocracy is only known in Western tradition, and in some other attempt we see that they are trying to establish an absolute. They have established an absolute monarchy. So to them there is no problem with that kind of institution. So, and many Muslims in general, they are promoting Western democracy. So there are a lot of confusion whether in this so-called Islamic political system can be truly called a theocracy or monarchy or democracy. So why there is such confusion? Because the framework is not clear. The framework is clear. So we have in one tendency, the modernists who promote the idea of Western democracy,
Yes.
the so-called Islamized Western democracy. But what they do is actually grafting Islam to Western democracy. In the other end, we have the conservative who promote the idea of absolute monarchy or theocracy. So there is huge gap between the two school of thought. So
Yes.
that confusion must be addressed first. And in order to do that, we need to clarify the framework first. So when we are talking about Islamic political system, we are not talking about utopian ideas like, some scholars said, if we don't have a caliphate, then
Yep.
we are not going to accept it. So they are very idealistic, only to consider the time of Khulafa ar-Rashidin as Islamic. So the rest, the Umayyad, the Abbasid, the Ayyubids, we have more than 1,000, tradition of Islamic political institution. So they only regard only a few, decades of Khulafa ar-Rashidin. So human-made system, from our perspective, Islamic political system is man-made system, and therefore it is not rigid. It is human discretion. It is ijtihad. So for some time, Imam Al-Ghazali endorsed monarchy, for example. Our scholars in general, they endorse monarchy, but what kind of monarchy? So they have Islamized this monarchy. Right? So regardless whether it is Islamic monarchy or Islamic democracy or combination of both, we need to go beyond the form. We need to focus on the substance. So with regard to the substance, we must ask proper question like, what are the principles in Islamic political system? So the discourse should be on the substance rather than on the form. Thank you, Shafiq.
Thank you, Dr. Khalif, for that very elaborate explanation on how this issue has sort of basically lost its focus. And I'd just like to recap certain key points that I thought is very important, because I think when this matter is not being thought carefully, it has led to a great deal of extremism among Muslim groups, and some are very persistent on insisting that the Muslim community follow a particular form of political system, whereas you are saying, if you look at the greatest scholars in Islam, there has always been a room for ijtihad, just has been room for discretion by the Muslim scholars and community. So it's not so much about the form but more about the substance, but then this is basically what we have not been giving due emphasis on. But maybe for a very brief moment, Dr. Khalif, can you sort of clarify to us why didn't we give due emphasis to the substance, and why is this tendency on the form? Where did this line of thinking comes from, Dr. Khalif? I mean, because obviously, as you have explained very clearly, this does not represent the views of some of the most eminent scholars of Islam. But how did this view, this emphasis, preoccupation with the form of Islamic politics come to be given more emphasis, Dr. Khalif?
Yeah, your question, Shafiq, is something to do with the state of the mind, Muslim state of mind, meaning that we are colonized for so many years, right? And we have lost uh, with regard to the roots of our tradition, our civilization. We fail to benefit from the works of our scholars in the past. So somehow we are uprooted from our tradition. So therefore, the tendency is to follow whatever has been, put forward by Western thinkers. In the last session, I have highlighted these problems. Right? So what we aspire to do today, a new discourse that is to truly Islamize whatever ideas, theories, institution, concept that is in our disposition.
Okay.
So yeah, we need to develop politics as a science, Islamic political thought
Yes. Yes.
as a science. Yes.
Yes. Yes, and I believe this is what one of your main efforts have been in scholarship in higher education. For those who may not be aware, I think Dr. Khalif, one of the courses that he teaches at his postgraduate school at the RZS-CASIS is this course called Islamic Political Thought and Institutions. And I think you have made this point before in your discourses that this on the need to develop Islamic political thought as a science which has not been done sufficiently. And Dr. Khalif, do you also think do we have enough expertise in this regard?
Yeah, to develop Islamic political thought as a science, first of all, we must realize that it has not been concentrated. The attention has been, to follow, to imitate whatever has been developed in the West. So this idea of Islamic political thought as a science has been neglected.
Right.
So in the past, the term politics in our tradition is siyasa, right?
Yes.
So for example, the notion of siyasa and sasaya susu means to lead, meaning to have a good leadership, right? And the idea that the leader is a ra'i, that is a prophetic tradition. The leader is a ra'i, which means a shepherd. So there are implications to that. So all these key terms must be highlighted and studied properly. So in sum, we can say that siyasa or politics is about managing people to work together to achieve common goals,
Yes.
to develop a certain kind of leadership. So the first thing that has been emphasized in our tradition is that how do we create, how do we produce a just and good leaders?
Yes.
So what it takes, what is required, for us to produce that kind of leadership. The second thing that we need to emphasize is to establish a good and workable system that will facilitate the implementation of justice, because that is the goal. The objective is to implement justice, right? So what are the mechanisms needed to establish justice? So for example, in the past, our scholars concentrate on the idea of shura. And until today, unfortunately, many Muslim are confused with regard to the concept of shura.
Right.
Shura to them, to many of them, is majority rule, which is democratic, which is Western idea. So shura is not majority rule. In shura, the idea is to focus and to celebrate knowledge, whereas in majority rule, it's all about numbers. So whoever get the majority vote, then he or the idea must be accepted. So that very important, the idea of shura. How do we implement that in our institutions? Unfortunately, I don't see yet, this idea has been truly understood and implemented in our institution. The second, I give examples, is that the institution of Hizbah that has been developed by our scholars in the past. It's also a mechanism for check and balances. This idea of check and balances is important in our political system. So we have in our tradition, or in our civilization, the institution of Hizbah. And unfortunately, some Western country do have this idea of Hizbah, ombudsman, for example, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, when we try to implement this idea of Hizbah, it's very, very superficial kind of thing.
Yes.
So the idea of Hizbah is very important. And the idea of freedom of expression, also one of the main institution. The Muslim scholars, for example, in the past are feared, and they have the freedom to say anything they like, to the extent that the leader, the ruler, cannot do anything to them. So they have complete freedom. That is also we have not developed that kind of mechanism. So in all, we can see that we have many ideas in our tradition, in the writings of our scholars, such as the idea of limited government, and representative government, constitutional government. All this, of course, we know today from Western writings, right?
Yes.
But in my study, like John Locke, for example, always attributed to the one who is proposing or promoting this idea, but nobody questioned from where did he get this idea from. It is evident that he learned many ideas from a teacher called Edward Pocock in Oxford University, in 16th century, 17th century. And at that time, many works of Ibn Khaldun, Al-Mawardi, Imam Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina has been translated to Latin. So suddenly they are enlightened to this. We don't question them. Where did he get this idea of limited government, representative government, constitutional government? It went from our perspective, because we learn from these writings of our great scholars. We know that this idea comes from Muslim scholars. So unfortunately, this politics as Islamic politics as a science, as a independent science, or a proper science, has not been studied properly. It has been neglected, and we have not been able to benefit from the works of our scholars in the past.
Dr. Khalif, I would just like to seek your clarification, because you highlighted a very important point when clarifying or elaborating on what should be involved in this whole discussion on establishing or developing this Islamic political thought as a science. And I think you mentioned the notion of shura with regards to a workable system to realize justice. And when you speak of shura, you made an important point. I think contrary to many previous authors or commentators on politics in Islam, you're saying that shura should not be understood simply as a rule of majority, but in reality, if you look how it is understood and practiced, it refers to a proper recognition and acknowledgement, or to celebrate the knowledge of the authorities of knowledge. Because I think, could you clarify on this point, Doctor? Because I think when you said to celebrate the authorities, maybe it's not quite clear what would this imply. Because would you say this is why the ulama played such a prominent role vis-a-vis in relation to the umara in the past? Is this what how shura worked? So there's a close relation with
I give
ulama
you one
umara?
example. In the past, when Sayyidina Umar tried to introduce new idea that the booties of war, it should not be divided to only to mujahideen, right?
Yes.
Because that will make the rich become richer and the poor become poorer. So rather, Sayyidina Umar introduced that this land of Iraq should remain to the original owner, and yet they have to pay some taxes to the government. So it will increase the revenue of the state, right, of the government. At that time, the majority didn't agree, because that will give an idea that at the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, that decision was wrong. The time of the Prophet himself, the decision was wrong. So it is new idea. The companion afraid of doing something new, innovation. They regard it as innovation. But Sayyidina Umar, took 3 days to convince the companion who refused this new idea. So the majority opposed this idea, but he kept arguing with them. So the room is still there, whether or not the majority likes the idea. In modern time, we try to make a very quick decision based on what the majority view.
Right.
So that's is very wrong. So there is no room for difference of opinion on to really check on the argument, whether a person has a strong argument or not. What is the basis? What is the evidence that he put forward? So we need to analyze. We need to study this argument.
Yes.
And then we make decision based on learn and wisdom. So the imam or the leader must have knowledge. Otherwise, he follow whatever the majority vote.
Okay, Dr. Khalif, speaking of that, now that we have about 5 minutes in our show, I was wondering whether you could lastly sort of expand a bit about when you said that part of this Islamic political thought as a science, part of these contents is there needs to be some discussions on how to develop the right kind of leadership or just leadership. Can you perhaps give your thoughts on that, Dr. Khalif? What would this entail?
Of course, many things that we are discussing right now, Shafiq, need hours to be explained, right? So whatever I mentioned here is just to spark a discussion, right?
Yes.
in order for us to produce good leaders, in the past we have that good leaders. For example, exemplified in the such leaders like Sultan Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi, Sayyidina Umar himself, Umar bin Abdul Aziz. In even in Malay world, we have Iskandar Thani and so on and so forth. So we need to ask question: what makes them great leaders? So we study what really the requirement that we need to have first, the ecosystem. So ultimately, we know that it boils down to the question of ethics. That they become truly good leaders because they are ethical people. They are developed spiritually, morally, and they have this the so-called 4 cardinal virtues Imam Ghazali talk about. So they are the first of all, and before they can implement justice, they themselves is the embodiment of justice. So the question we need to ask today, whether we emphasize on that ethics, and from our perspective, doesn't stand alone. From Western perspective, that's all, ethics. And when they talk about ethics, they talk about philosophical ethic.
Yes.
But from our perspective, ethics requires metaphysical worldview, theology, religion, and iman. So there is no ethic without religion.
Yes.
What has been emphasized by our luminaries is the relationship between ethics and the root of that, which is religion and theology. So all this with regard to metaphysical worldview. So when we see that the connection between justice, ethics, and religion, and how our scholars emphasize that connection, that's how we can benefit from them. So I would like to advise, the audience to benefit from these works of great scholars like Imam Al-Ghazali. And in our Malay tradition, we have the works such Raja Ali Haji, Thamaratul Muhimmah, Diafa'an Kubara wa Ahlil Mahkamah, and also Muqaddimah fi Intizam al-Mulk. Both of these manuscript has been studied by myself and introduced and published by Dewan Bahasa and Pustaka in 2016. So from that kind of works, we can benefit from our tradition in order for us to develop our institution better for the future.
Alhamdulillah, Dr. Khalif, indeed, as you said earlier, I think a lot of your discussions, doesn't do justice to this short period of time that we have on this radio show. But inshallah, we hope our listeners have been inspired and have triggered some further interest to look further and maybe to reach out to Dr. Khalif, as scholars like him, and the materials and the great literatures, the great books of the past, of the ulama of the past that Dr. Khalif has drawn our attention to, which indeed remains pertinent to our time today and the future. Thank you so much, Dr. Khalif, for your time, and inshallah we hope to have further discussions to benefit more from your insights on the subject of Muslim political thought. Ladies and gentlemen, we are really honored to have with us Dr. Khalif Muammar. He is the director of the Zarith-Sofiah Center for Advanced Studies on Islam, Science and Civilization, RZS-CASIS, based in University of Technology Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, to share with us on this topic concerning reviving a wiser Muslim thought. With that, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.